In her 2018 book, Hannah Pollin-Galay introduces the concept of ecologies of witnessing. She uses this term to write about how the setting of an oral testimony, the time and place in which it was recorded, profoundly influenced both its content and format. Pollin-Galay is certainly not the first scholar to pay close attention to Holocaust testimonies. Indeed, her work builds on important foundations laid by Annette Viviorka, Zoe Waxman, Noah Shanker, among others. Pollin-Galay's work developed out of these scholars, as well as from her own interviews with survivors, her literary training, and her attention to language. She shows that Holocaust testimonies, even when produced at the same time and by the same institutions, differ greatly due to the country and language in which they are recorded. Pollin-Galay chose a relatively homogeneous group of survivors, Lithuanian Jews, who were young adults during the war, and closely analyzed their testimonies in Yiddish in Lithuania, in Hebrew in Israel, and in English in the United States. With this narrow focus, she's able to demonstrate numerous and dramatic ways that the ecologies of witnessing shape the resultant testimonies. In this brief paper, I would like to apply her insights to the post-war memorial books that I'm currently studying. As is probably well known in this crowd, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust began producing yizkor bikher, or memorial volumes, in the DP camps immediately after the war and have not really stopped. Hundreds of volumes have come out in the ensuing years. Certainly the heyday has passed, but not only do the books themselves continue to trickle out, but there is also a project of translation that means that older books are being reissued in accessible formats. Most of the books came out in Israel, although the US, Canada, France, and Argentina were also centers of post-war Jewish life and memorial book publication. While a few were published in the 1940s, their numbers increased in the ensuing decades and crested in the 1970s. The question I would like to ask today is how the time and place of publication may have influenced different volumes. In other words, can we learn from examining memorial volumes in the context of their ecologies of memory? It is also, obviously, a bigger question than one can answer in a 20-minute conference presentation, let alone a 10-minute one, as a result of time constraints, as well as the fact that I'm in the early stages of this research. This will be more along the lines of notes toward a further research and a further answer than an actual answer to the question. One way to narrow in on variations among the portrayals of the past in different memorial books is to examine multiple books describing the same town. Not every Jewish community in Eastern Europe has even a single yizkor book, but some of the more prominent locations have more than one. While not setting out with the same question, a number of scholars have nonetheless sought to juxtapose these texts. In his fascinating historical treatment of the Galician city of Brody, Boris Kuzmany uses a broad definition of memorial books to discuss how books from the Soviet, Ukrainian, Polish, and Jewish perspectives all contribute to constructing separate versions of collective memory within the same geographic sphere. All tell their own story of this multi-ethnic city. In the case of the three Jewish books devoted to Galicia more generally that include Brody, and the one that is specifically about Brody, non-Jews are virtually absent. The Hebrew volume, Ner Tamid Yizkor LeBrody, devoted entirely to Brody, has more historical information than the others, although Kuzmany notes that much of it is from a Zionist point of view. The only major breach in the presentation of Brody as a straightforward Jewish city before the war is the inclusion and translation of Julian Tuwim's famous poem, We Polish Jews, from 1944. In addition to the Polish original, the editors included translations into Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. Kuzmany points out that Tuwim's pained post-war confrontation with the strongly held Polish allegiance of so many Jews in interwar Poland, while presumably an accurate representation of the pre-war Jewish population of Brody, contrasts with the narrative of the rest of the book. I hope to find other examples of scholars examining multiple yizkor bikher from the same location in conjunction, as well as to engage in this analysis on my own. Another method of examining the ecologies of memory is to look at commonalities among yizkor bikher from the same location, even if regarding different towns. Many of the yizkor bikher published in Israel, for example, include photographs and names of soldiers who fell in Israel's wars alongside the Holocaust dead. This is perhaps understandable in regard to newly arrived Eastern European refugees who fought and died in Israel's War of Independence. In many cases, these refugees had only just gotten off the boat. Even when they had moved to Palestine earlier, they were the contemporaries of the memorial book's editors. They were all part of a cohort of Jews who died during and immediately after the Second World War. Sefer Tiktin, published in 1959 in Israel, for example, uses this interesting formulation for the section devoted to former residents of Tikocz in Poland who died fighting either in the British forces during the Second World War or in the Haganah afterward. That is, children or sons of Tiktin who fell on behalf of their people and their land. This section comes immediately after the necrology of Holocaust losses and the list of survivors from Tikocz. For the community of Jews from Tikocz residing in Israel in the 1950s, all of the terrible deaths were part of the same period which saw the destruction of their community. But while the continuity of conflict and trauma in the 1940s and even into the 1950s makes sense, it's harder to justify the inclusion of Israel's later wars in the narrative memorial books for towns in Eastern Europe. In the case of Lask, Sefer Zikaron Le'ir Ve'em B'Yisrael, published in 1968, it would appear that there had been no original plan to include contemporary wars. But the afterglow of Israel's seemingly miraculous victory in 1967, in the very midst of completing the volume, demanded attention. It was too late to add an additional section to the volume, so the editor, as you see in the table of contents, shoehorned an essay entitled The Victory of Israel in 1967 into the section of the book devoted to the Shoah, or Holocaust. In the brief essay that he wrote, the editor explained that the narrowly averted Shoah, destruction, of the state of Israel and the Jewish people was deeply felt by the survivors and refugees from Wask. Similarly, the editors of Sefer yizkor le-kedoshe Psheitsh, published in the aftermath of the 1973 Yom Kippur War in Israel, found a way of including their most recent war dead. On the page devoted to Rami Levy, for example, the reader learns that the young man who died in October 1973 was born in October 1950 in Poland. Levy may have never visited the Polish town of Przedecz. It's most likely that if his parents were residing in Poland in 1950, they would have moved from the smaller town into one of the centers of post-war Jewish life, such as Łódź or a town in Lower Silesia. Yet the photo of him as a boy, lighting a memorial candle at a plaque for the martyrs of Psheitsh in the Martef HaShoah, the so-called Chamber of the Holocaust in Jerusalem, ties him to the place. From what I have seen, memorial books published outside of the State of Israel do not include the same level of explicit engagement with national themes. This is not surprising, as Jews elsewhere did not reside in a Jewish state. The political and sociological changes in their adopted countries were less relevant to the memorialization of their hometowns. Additionally, in its early years in particular, Israel struggled to assimilate the survivors and refugees and their stories. The public disdain for Holocaust victims, for the Yiddish language, and for focusing on the diaspora in early Israel is well known. Anat Hellman has noted that the sort of nostalgia for aspects of the East European Jewish past that became popular in the United States in the mid-20th century took a lot longer to reach Israel. In these memorial volumes, survivors of the Holocaust and refugees from Europe created their own hybrid memorial culture, which combined a deep connection to the old country with active participation in the State of Israel's memorial culture. Yet another area that I hope to pursue is the use of language and translation within the volumes and what it says about the ecologies of memory. Most of the books contain at least two languages. Books published in Israel generally have sections in Yiddish and Hebrew. Those from the United States are more likely to combine Yiddish and English. In some cases, the entire book is in two languages. More frequently, the two sections of the book differ. Rarely do the editors explain explicitly their translation decisions. Sefer Zikaron L'Kehilat Kolna is an exception. Published in Israel, the volume contains hundreds of pages of documents, essays, poetry, and pictures in Yiddish and Hebrew. At the end is a 70-page English language section. The introduction there explains that in general, contributions were published in the language in which they were submitted. However, the essays about the Holocaust were translated and published in both Yiddish and Hebrew. The English section is a digest of the entire volume. For the purposes of these editors, first-hand testimonies of the Holocaust were the most important content. But readers in English, they felt, deserved a general introduction to the town. Questions of priority in translations continue to play out in the crowdsourced translation projects of yizkor bikher currently taking place online. On the website Jewish Gen, one can find versions of various yizkor bikher that are currently translation projects for. In this one example from Kalish, we see that the Hebrew section of the book has received more attention than the Yiddish section, and that there are more translations of reminiscences from before the war than during. But this is just one example. I hope to see if there are trends regarding what gets translated into English. I'm also interested in looking at the translations, and especially how they deal with some of the pain, anger, and hatred expressed in the original. Within the ecology of memory of post-war survivors, writing in Jewish languages, there was room to discuss divine and human vengeance and revenge. I'm curious to find out how the contemporary English language ecology of memory will assimilate that sort of content. Translation is thus not only a subject of study, but also a metaphor for this project. Another way of articulating the concept of ecologies of memory is to think about the ways that memorial books are translated across time and space. In Writing in Tongues, her exploration of the translation of Yiddish literature in the 20th century, Anita Norwich presents, among other things, the vastly different translations of the same poems and stories, depending on the time and place. This paper represents first steps into considering how the translation and ecologies of memory can be applied to the study of memorial volumes. I look forward to expanding this work, as well as to learning from other participants in this conference.